Hi, this is my review of Flintloque Death in the Snow 28mm scale black powder fantasy skirmish gamebook. This is one of the ways to get started with Flintloque. As you may remember, some time ago I reviewed the starter set Escape from the Dark Czar. If you haven't seen that review, I'm going to put the link in the description below, so I recommend that you check that out, although that is not necessary to understand the content of this review of Death in the Snow. This is the PDF version. This is the entire core rulebook. That is, if you only wanted one book to get started with Flintloque and play Flintloque for as much as you want, you can get this Death in the Snow book. But this book represents one of the theaters of war of Flintloque. That is, if you wanted to explore other themes and stories, for example, there is one that features the conflict in Catalusia or Catalusia. There is a book for that with the title of War in Catalusia. So I'm going to put the link in the description below to the different ways that you can get started with Flintloque, so you can check those out as well. Death in the Snow feels a lot like an action comedy that seems right out of a Tim Burton story. There is a bit of a horror element. This contains the entire rules, also the army lists, the different special rules for the different factions. Death in the Snow also contains scenarios, campaign rules, pretty much everything that you would need to play Flintloque for the rest of your life. So there is great value in this book. It's very complete. Now let's talk about the quality of the PDF. I only have two criticisms. One of them is minor, one could be a bit more important. First, there are a few typos. I spotted like 4 typos, but they didn't present an obstacle for me to understand the content of the book. The other thing is that this PDF doesn't contain bookmarks or hyperlinks, so it's going to be somewhat difficult to move around the rules, especially during a game, if you're looking for a specific rule or something. So I recommend that you print this book, or that you make some notes about some of the rules that you sometimes have trouble with. It's also important to note that this Death in the Snow has a starter set that I will be reviewing in about probably a couple of months. So you may want to consider that option if you already don't own some Flintloque miniatures or Napoleonic miniatures, because this game is quite easy to play with proxies as well. However, I recommend that you get the Flintloque miniatures. You may remember from my battle reports, and if you haven't seen them, the links are going to be in the description as well, that those miniatures look pretty awesome on the battlefield. And when it comes to the rest of the quality, it's top-notch. Everything is well written and organized, very easy to understand the rules, and even though at times there could be some complicated areas because there are some modifiers that you have to take into account when concerning movement and shooting, I think the organization and the explanation does a great job at getting you into those intricate or deeper points of Flintloque. The entire book is also well designed, that is, it has an old school type of graphic design with illustrations that focus on flavor and the action comedy side of Flintloque. So the quality overall is great despite those couple of criticisms that I mentioned. Now let's talk about the contents of the PDF. The book starts with a great introduction. If you haven't played war games or skirmish games before, this is the book for you. They even tell you how to improvise when using terrain in a particular table to create a battlefield, what Flintloque is all about. In fact, this game of Flintloque, it has a very strong roleplay feel to it. It even refers to itself as an adventure game, because you have those rules to advance during the campaigns. Your characters will become stronger. There is a strong narrative focus or scenario-driven gameplay. So it's going to feel like a role-playing game. And this rulebook of Death in the Snow even comes with solo rules. So that also means that if you wanted to play like a cooperative game with someone who's just getting started with Flintloque, you could do that and you could fight against this artificial intelligence presented in this book. So Death in the Snow will be a great place to get started with war games and skirmish games. Then the book gives you information of the world of Balan. The plotline is this. Emperor Mordred has just managed to seize the empire from the hands of his aging mother, the Empress Morgana. He also took her magical ring. So now he has annulled the aura of wild magic that has been covering the entire world of Balan. And this is magic with a CK and an E, so it's magic. So Mordred, with the suppression of this magical force, he decided to develop the firearms known as Flintlocks. So these are very powerful weapons that with proper training, any group of soldiers can face off against any threat, natural or supernatural. So Flintlocks are now the weapon of choice, and Mordred began a campaign of world conquest. Many other races decided to ally with him, but many others decided to stand against him. His mother in particular, Empress Morgana, or former Empress, is looking for support to stand against Mordred. So Mordred took a meteoric rise into power, and he found out that there is this powerful sword, the Sword of Shivalia. He wants to get his hands on this powerful sword that was once in the hands of a very powerful elven war god. And even though Mordred's patron deity is Von Fachte, he wants to get his hands on this sword regardless, because this could lead him to further power and perhaps even immortality. And if you haven't noticed already, this is obviously like a parody on the Napoleonic Wars, Mordred being Napoleon Bonaparte. Throughout the entire story and plotline, you have different scenario seats. These are full-fledged scenarios. They have all the details concerning the different participant forces, and even information on how to play the scenario as a points match. You also have information on the layout of the battlefield and some special rules. So it's really good because as you read the story of Death in the Snow, you see all of these different conflicts and wars that have happened during different sections of the timeline. And all of the missions are quite varied, but also they seem focused completely on overcoming the odds of the scenario. Not all of them are exactly balanced, but you do have some winning conditions, because for example, in one scenario you play as a troll that has to fight a lot of undead, and they tell you from the very start, you are going to die in this battlefield, in this conflict. There's probably no way of the troll surviving. However, his winning condition is that he has to kill a certain number of enemies before dying. But there are also other scenarios, one in particular where you have to escape from an attack of golems, and you may actually get a greater victory if you collect some samples from those golems, but that means that you have to get close and personal with them. There's also a scenario where you need to escort a number of elves from one side to the other. The standard table size to play a game of Flintloque is 6x3 or even 6x4. But you could also play smaller or larger games. If you wanted to, it's quite easy to adapt them depending on the miniatures that you are using and the type of scenario. So that's very flexible. You can play Flintloque almost anywhere. There are also some scenarios where you need to assassinate a particular character, or protect another type of character, or carry out some sort of objective, recover something. There are also other scenarios where you need to drive the enemy force off the table, or completely annihilate the opposing force. So you have a good variety of them in general, and this is just the scenarios that you see throughout the main plotline. There's also a section in the book that shows other scenarios with a different structure and even with complete maps. So Mordred decided to look for this Sword of Shivalia, so he went into the dreaded Witchlands up north to gather clues about this powerful weapon. The Witchlands are a very dangerous and scary place. There are undead everywhere, and there are also mortal troops. However, Mordred will come into an alliance with centaurs and werewolves, although there are other, for example, werewolves that are still on the side of the Witchlands. So Mordred continues his slow but steady advance into the Witchlands. You can see how his troops became quite unnerved when they first encountered the undead. There are a lot of ruins, abandoned places in the Witchlands, and in one of those seemingly abandoned places, Mordred stumbled upon Lady Rosafind. She seduced Mordred with promises of power and immortality, and struck an alliance with him. And she promised him said immortality if he aided her in defeating her enemy, which would be Lady Draxul. Lady Rosafind had Mordred under her sway. However, Galahad Ney, Mordred's finest marshal, was suspicious of Lady Rosafind, but Mordred would have none of it. So, following Rosafind's advice, they basically stumbled upon a very terrible ambush that almost annihilated the entire Grand Arc du Nord, because the entire army was already divided as they made their way into the Witchlands, and they basically marched into the dreaded charnel city of the dreaded Star Wraith himself, that is Alexander. And after barely making it out alive from that place, this is the main conflict or series of events in Death in the Snow: the escape or tactical retreat and regrouping of the remaining forces. And I really enjoy how they work the scenario seeds with these details of the main storyline. There are some missions that actually require one force to decapitate a particular member and escape with that head to prove their loyalty to the rulers, and they even have to wait one turn while they are cutting the head off. So there are some gruesome details to express the theme of Death in the Snow, of the Witchlands, of the horror of the undead. There are some scenarios that are well suited for solo rules as well, and another scenario for 3 players. In general, it's recommended that Flintloque is played with 4 players, but I imagine you could also accommodate a few more. After the main storyline, you have all of the background information from the different armies and the sub-factions involved. That is, you have information on their ranks, their organization, the agendas, and how each army is composed of different races, because, for example, the Grande Armée du Nord has elves as the majority of its forces, but it also contains dwarves and trolls, trollkin and trollka, the dogmen as well. There is a lot when it comes to the variety of the troops that you can use to build your section for a particular battle. Death in the Snow is mostly on the skirmish side of things. If you want to play a more of a mass battles type of game, that you would need the Slaughterloo rulebook for that, but this one focuses completely on the skirmish side, and there are so many armies. You could have an army composed entirely of dogmen, or of trollkin or trollka, or of just elves, or a combination of both of the forces. And later on, when we take a look at the special rules, you could see that there are some bonuses or perks when taking different races for your army. And when it comes to the undead side of things, they are mostly composed of undead, of course, zombies, but you also have sub-ant undead that are undead a bit more self-aware, with a bit more intelligence. And you also have leagues and vampires. Now, the leagues are basically like antennas that communicate the authority of the Star Wraith Alexander. And vampires, they may have their own agendas, and for all intents and purposes, at least technically, they are considered mortal because they have extraordinary abilities when compared to more brainless type of undead. They also have access to different magical powers, but they can still be killed, while undead, they can be raised almost indefinitely. The undead in general represent Russia in this fantasy game, so you can find some familiar names or sounding names, such as the Commissariat Gravitsky Vryov, that is the KGB of the Witchlands. So you can see how this conflict is sort of like a parody of the real Napoleonic Wars. You have an entire chapter focused on scenarios, telling you how to come up with your own scenarios, where you can get some ideas as sources of inspiration, how to create some special rules, how to link scenarios for an entire campaign. And even, as I was telling you, we have some more structured scenarios with entire maps, that is graphics of the layout of the battlefield. Some of them you have to move forces, perhaps across sort of like a frozen wasteland, and some parts of the wasteland is just fragile, very thin ice, and if you move your troops outside of a particular route, there is a risk that they will fall into the ice and die. Some other scenarios feature just trying to hold on inside a structure, trying to survive, while you are surrounded by the forces of the Witchlands. They even have some tips and advice on how to handle each scenario. They recommend in a scenario, for example, they could tell you that a particular force is at a disadvantage and it's better for the most experienced player to play as the disadvantaged party or group of soldiers. So this is perfect to use those scenarios right away or to come up with your own scenarios. You also have information on how to create your own commanders and soldiers and sections and regiments within Flintloque. Even though there are some special characters, and do check out the Alternative Armies website, remember to check out the links below. You can see many of those named characters there with free to download special rules and their complete stats. But when it comes to the entirety of the forces participating in this conflict, you have the stats and the special rules for all of the troops involved. Each troop could be of different power levels. Some of them could be raw, some others average, more experienced or veteran, or even legendary. On the undead side of things, you have savant zombies and vampires, but you also have undead at different stages of decay. You can have like fresh undead, decaying undead, rotten undead, and even skeletons at the very end. And as you play the different scenarios in a campaign, the undead will start to rot away, and this affects their values most of the time for the worse and then for the better. It depends. Although you'll see how this balances out with the composition of the undead and their progress through the campaign. So there are many ways in which you can customize your characters, choosing skills, traits and flaws, and even some magic. Even though the law of wild magic has been annulled, there is still some magic left in the world. You also have information for the points cost of the sections. As I was telling you, you can play Flintloque as a competitive experience, not focusing too much on scenarios, although I think Flintloque plays a lot better when you make scenarios paramount or the objective of gameplay. When it comes to the changes that happen throughout the campaign, you basically make a roll for all of those soldiers or figures that were annihilated during gameplay. So there is a chance that they will survive or they make it out alive, but with some injuries, some even long-term injuries. So you have to really take care of your troops. You never know how the result of a scenario is going to affect any following scenarios. But if you're playing, for example, against the undead, some of the troops that die actually add to the ranks of the undead. So this is somewhat of a balancing effect. The mortal troops of the Grande Armée du Nord, they get to gain new skills and they become better as they advance from raw to average to experienced. They become better at shooting and carrying out melee attacks. However, when it comes to the undead, they are replaced by those that die in battle. However, remember that the undead decay through the different scenarios. So those troops that were effective during a particular battle may not be so much in the next one. So you have all the rules and also some differences when it comes to, for example, vampires and gargoyles, because they are considered mortal characters. So there is quite a bit of intricacy and depth. You have to think ahead in the long term of how things will develop through the entire campaign. When it comes to the wild magic, you have two types of magic in play. You have blood magic that we'll talk about later on, but you also have the more standard magic that there is a chance that one of your troops, even a normal soldier, could be magically talented. So you have a die roll that you make to see what types of magical powers, if any, a particular character has. So maybe your character has the ability of preventing injuries, or he has a supernatural magical shot, so he has a bonus to accuracy and impact, or maybe that character has winged feet and moves really fast. Or maybe he has some sort of control over gravity and he can actually paralyze some figures that he targets. Or maybe your character can cause fear. Or maybe your character has hammer hands, so supernaturally strong hands, so you're going to be quite deadly up close and personal. So there are different magic abilities that you can use. When it comes to skills, there's also a good variety. They give bonuses in different situations. So for example, you have the brawler skill that is perfect to enhance your melee potential. You also have the boarding technique, which is great for characters that are armed with pistols. So you can fire at point blank after moving into contact with an enemy figure. And you have the points for each of these skills, because you cannot just take a lot of skills without taking the cost into consideration. If you're playing specifically a points match, or if you want to balance scenarios a bit more, it's important to take notice of how many points each skill costs. Maybe you also have the dodge skill, so you're really good at avoiding the thrust of a sword or a bayonet. Or maybe you are really alert, so you gotta have a bonus in activation rolls. Or maybe you are quite stealthy, or you have improved discipline, etc. You also have traits. These are characteristics, or perhaps even talents, that your character begins with. They may not be earned during play. So maybe your character is actually a large fellow, so you ignore the engagement zones of different figures, and you also have bonus when it comes to movement and your melee impact. Or maybe your character is a natural leader, or you're really steadfast, so you have a bonus in your discipline modifier. Maybe you have jamminess, so this character has some uncanny luck. You can actually reroll any one die roll for the entire game. Or maybe you have nerves of steel, or really good reflexes, etc. And of course you also have flaws. As you can see, this looks a lot like a role-playing game. These flaws actually give you points when building your force, but they will add some penalties to different situations, because for example, maybe you have milky eyes. Your character was born with poor eyesight, so you cannot target enemies above a certain column of fire, and you also suffer a penalty in your aiming. So this is a good flaw to take if you want like a melee-oriented character. Or maybe your character is cowardly and you have a penalty when it comes to steady and discipline ratings. Or maybe your character has low pain tolerance. Or maybe there is animosity between different characters and they will not assist each other during play. So there are many different flaws that you can use to balance out the use of your skills or the selection of your skills. You also have skills, traits, and flaws specific to different races, because for example, the Ferak Elves, they have skills such as First Strike or Astonishing Reactions. They have traits such as Graceful Steps or Steady Elf Hands. And they have flaws such as Cruel Pointed Ear or Vanity for Advancement. And they offer related or expected penalties and bonuses to different things. When it comes to, for example, the Confederation of Finkelstein, which is composed of dwarves, dogmen, and ogres. You have some things for the dwarves. Maybe you have a bullet beard, really thick beard that protects you from firearms. Or maybe you have the trait of Misfire Misser, or the flaw of a height complex. When it comes to the dogmen, you have a big bark. You even have a very cool attack, which is known as Flea Collar. So you have this collar that protects you from fleas, but you still have that cloud of fleas around you, and you can actually control them. You have trained them to become a special weapon. You also have some traits such as Dog Nose, and some flaws such as Werewolf Antagonist. When it comes to the ogres, you have the Super Kill skill, the trait of being a brutal beast, and the flaw of actually having a weak heart or even a cannibal. Your ogre could even eat one of your own characters during battle. The werewolves of the Iberia have long fangs. They also have the trait of wolf lip and the flaw of being a dogman antagonist. As you can see, there is sort of like a conflict between dogmen and werewolves. Then you also have the centaurs with the skills of Iron Lancer, the traits of a killer horse kick, but perhaps the flaw of hoof rot. And these are just some of the skills, traits, and flaws. There are many more when it comes to each race and faction in Flintloque. You also have the Trollka of Scandavia. They have the skills of having troll blood, that is, they can regenerate. You have traits such as weapon breaker, and the flaws of having rock veins. Then you have the trollkin of cup and dust, that have stony skin as a skill, or the trait of coming back from the dead, and the flaw of having bad pigment, that is, you are simply too bright and you are easy to spot and shoot from a distance. You also have vampire skills, traits, and flaws. So maybe you have vampiric lunge as a skill, or you have the trait of vampiric dexterity, or the flaw of being a gloater. You spend some time gloating upon a fallen enemy and you waste some time doing that. When it comes to Savant Undead, you have skills such as Mortal Kickback, the trait of Super Savant, so you're superior to other Savant zombies, for example. Or maybe you have the flaw of not being reanimated properly, so you're not very good at taking damage and being steady in certain situations. Then you have leech skills, traits, and flaws. Maybe you have an eye blast, that is, you actually project like an energy attack from your eyes. You have the trait of Leechlysis, which is basically a very evil and powerful leech. So you have additional red points, and we'll talk about red points later on. Or maybe you have the flaw of being the weakest link. You also have golems that are very powerful, but they do not have skills or traits or flaws, they're just constructs. You have ghouls with, for example, the skill of Bug Muncher, or the trait of a nose for it, so a perfect sense of smell. And when it comes to the Bug Muncher, you have quicker reactions because you have been capturing bugs. And you have the flaw of flesh cravers, or you're always hungry and you may do some irrational things because of it. And then we have gargoyle skills and traits and flaws such as Envelope, so you can fold your wings around yourself to protect you. You have traits such as Chalky Blood, so if you get hit in melee, your blood spews out and it could be inhaled by those around you and they suffer choking damage. And then you have flaws such as Wild Flyer, so this means that you are a bit reckless or disobedient, so you have a penalty to your discipline rating. When it comes to raids, you have skills such as Zombie Puppet, that allows the character to take over any undead character who is not a leech for a number of turns. This is useful when a leech is somewhat far away from the other undead, and we will talk about that later on in the system. You also have a trait such as a Creepy Thing, so this raid is really scary, and any attacks made against it by mortals, they have a penalty to their melee attacks. But raids, because they are somewhat ghostly, they have a weak grip as well, that could be a potential flaw. Now let's talk about the rules of Flintloque. If you have already played the starter set Escape from Dark Czar, you almost know everything that there is to know about the Flintloque core system. This Death in the Snow rulebook just goes further into details concerning different factions and troops, some special rules, some things related to command points and red points as well. You have a section detailing terms and definitions that is also going to be quite handy concerning the new things presented in this Death in the Snow book. And then you have all the information concerning the character profiles, the different values, that is the steady value, that is mostly a representation of your mental fortitude and physical toughness and personal courage, perhaps even a bit of luck, so it's great to avoid getting hurt. You also have the wounds characteristic, how much damage you can take, the melee value, that is the positive or negative modifier during melee combat. You also have accuracy, that is how good you are at handling firearms, muskets, pistols, etc. And your discipline rating, representing your ability to carry on, and this is especially important for the leader of the section. You have information of the different experience ratings and troop types. Depending on your troop type, you're going to be a bit more specialized in certain tasks or maneuvers in the battlefield, and you will be able to be equipped or armed with different weaponry. You also have information of, for example, troops like civilians and undead troops, such as gunners or cavalry. Now, each section in the game should be represented by a leader, of course, that is the section officer. And it's also good to have a second in command in case that officer gets killed or eliminated in some other way. Maybe he flees from the battle. And you can have, for example, dastardly officers that are great when they want to put one of their own troops in the way of fire of harm, they can actually escape certain death by sacrificing one of the other troops. You also have heroic officers that is quite the opposite. They're actually easier to wound, but they inspire all the troops around them. You also have other types of officers, such as the aggressive officer, the cowardly officer. You also have information on vampire officer reputation. Maybe your vampire is wrathful, so this vampire officer seeks to cleanse the world of mortals. So, for example, you always activate first, and you are constantly trying to drink the blood of your enemies. Or maybe your vampire is diabolical, or artistic, remorseful. There are many bonuses and penalties related to these different types of psychological traits for vampires. You set up your forces in Flintloque according to the scenario, or if you are playing a points match. You usually set your section near a table edge or a particular terrain feature, and you try to accomplish an objective before your opponent. Each turn is divided in 4 phases. That is the initiative phase, the action phase, the wound resolution phase, and the maintenance phase. Let's take a look at each of these phases separately. The initiative phase, of course, is to determine who goes first. And this is where command points play a very special part. If your forces are mortals, they gain a number of command points per turn. These command points can be spent, for example, to re-roll the initiative roll. However, undead gain dread. Accumulating dread is not as easy, but is potentially more powerful. It depends on the chaos that you create in the battlefield. Because, for example, if your undead forces outnumber the mortal enemies, or if they have killed enemies, or each time in the last turn that an undead character won a round in melee, you will get dread points that you can spend in different ways. But if, for example, your lich has been killed, or for each undead character that has been killed in the last turn, you will actually take losses of dread points. So dread points, in contrast to command points, they are not as reliable. You do not get them the same amount each turn, but they can potentially be more substantial. If you cause a lot of chaos on the battlefield, you will have a lot more dread points when compared to command points, and that is the difference. When it comes to dread, you can spend them in different powers. You can spend them when your undead characters become confused to remove that confusion. You can motivate your troops, or you can cause an aura of horror, or you can spend, for example, 3 dread to restore 1 wound to any undead character. So the entire force feels a lot like a force of necromancers. You could also use dread to perform lich transmogrification. That is, when a lich is dead, you can perform a transmogrification so that one of your undead is replaced by a new lich. It's kind of like the awareness or consciousness of the lich travels to a new corpse and once again becomes undead. This is important because liches are the only ones who can control undead, keep them from becoming confused or getting brain freeze, that is, getting paralyzed, and accumulating dread points. So it's always important to keep a lich around to provide those dread bonuses and keep the other undead from becoming confused, getting brain freeze, etc. Now let's move on to the action phase. This phase is divided in 4 sub-phases. First, you can activate up to 2 figures. Maybe you just want to activate 1 and wait for your opponent to take action before moving more troops. But you need to check if that particular figure is able to be activated. If that figure already has an activation token, you cannot activate it again unless there is some other sort of condition or special ability that allows you to do that. But if you do not have an activation token, but you have other tokens like hits or shaken tokens, then you have to carry out a check. And this check has some modifiers related to, for example, maybe you won the initiative or not, or maybe there is a friendly standard bearer or musician playing at a certain distance from you. You will have some modifiers that will assist you in this check and will actually allow you to act, or in the case of the shaken token, it will keep you from fleeing the battlefield. When it comes to the zombies, as I was telling you, they need to remain close to their liches. Otherwise, they will get brain freeze and confusion. They will not be able to act as well as living troops when they get hit. However, in contrast, when a living soldier takes hits, there is a chance that he may not act at all or act as you would expect them. But when it comes to undead, they are always acting despite taking hits, because they represent those mindless undead shambling forward, but they do have a reduction as to the number of actions they can do depending on the number of hits that they take. In this part of the rules, they give you all the details on how to carry out charge actions, especially important, for example, for cavalry, because if they fail a charge, they kind of become unbalanced, they become shaken. You also have details on flying undead cavalry, that is, you have some bonuses when moving around the battlefield. You are also harder to hit when you fly up high, but if your mount gets killed, then it's almost certain death when you fall from your mount. A lot more dangerous when compared to normal or more standard cavalry. You also have information on musicians and standard bearers, how they add those bonuses during the different checks, and how the undead musicians and standard bearers, they actually inflict penalties. They cause fear upon mortals with their music and their horrible standards. When it comes to the first phase or sub-phase of the tactical maneuver phase, you decide how to move your character and if you are going to shoot or carry out a melee attack. You have a little table depending on the firearm that you are using, and the more that you move, the less effective you will be at firing. Because, for example, if you take a quick march, you're going to be able to fire but less effectively. This is with one right shift. And if you double march, for example, you simply will not be able to fire at all. But if you move slowly, you will be able to fire quite accurately. And depending on the distance, it's going to be a bit more difficult. You need to basically roll a percentage dice below a certain number, because, for example, if you fire up close, if you're using a Ferrach elf musket, you only need to roll 70 or below that. But maybe you take a shot at someone who is really far away at long distance, you would only be able to hit by rolling 20 or below, and the impact is drastically reduced. There is a lesser chance of actually killing your enemy, you will only just wound him. So it's a delicate balance, trying to figure out when it's worth it to actually move forward quite a bit at the expense or cost of being more accurate. But you can also take aim, but you fire later on in another subphase of the activation phase. You have all the information on cover and how movement is reduced as you move through it. You also have information on what happens with, for example, when you roll doubles. If you are a mortal and you roll a double, you could get a misfire or even a critical hit. Now, undead only get misfires because they have been somewhat programmed to reload, and they're not very skilled or technical in their flintlock technique, so they do not get critical hits. You also have rules on throwing grenades and how they scatter at certain distances when they don't hit their mark. And when it comes to melee, you move into base contact with your opponent. And the difference between melee and ranged combat is that in ranged combat, using muskets or types of weapons, you roll below a certain percentage, as I was telling you, and then the impact is taken into account. Each weapon, that is pistol, musket, canonderboss, they have an impact number, the higher the better. But in melee, the impact is the difference of a contested die roll. Each player rolls a die, and the difference is the impact. The winner deals that impact difference as damage. If you're outnumbered in melee, you're going to have a more difficult time. So it's always better to fight one-on-one or outnumbering your own opponent. You also have information on how bayonets and cavalry works in melee. Some command point options that you can spend with your officers to take defensive stances, make a heroic sacrifice, or finish off your opponent if he is heavily wounded. And in Flintlock, being heavily wounded carries a severe penalty, so keep that in mind. You also have information on how to perform the steady check. When you actually get hit, you roll a d10 and you add your character's steady rating and you subtract the impact of the attack. So depending on that, maybe you only get a few hits, or maybe you just get pushed back, but if you do really poorly in your role, you may be out of action, eliminated for that battle. So there is always a chance of dying immediately. This is a somewhat gritty game, it's better to take that into consideration all the time. And because combat happens in a somewhat simultaneous fashion, it feels a bit like Battletech. That is, even if you hit your opponent during that particular phase, he doesn't die right away unless he gets a really bad result in the die roll. He's still fighting and shooting and moving, and only at the end of the next phase, that is the wound resolution phase, you get to determine if your figure actually died. Then you have the aimed fire phase. As I was telling you, you can aim and fire with a bonus to your accuracy, but you act after everyone else, or at least everyone who wasn't aiming. Or maybe you decided to take a reload action, which usually takes one turn for you to spend reloading your weapon, or maybe it's a long reload. Some weapons take longer to reload and they have different types of ammunition, so it's also important to consider this. Then you have the wound and morale resolution phase. This is where you determine if your figures have survived all of those hits that they have taken, and depending on the casualties, maybe your section leader died, or maybe you have like forlorn or desperate troop type, they can get a shaken marker. When it comes to maintenance and victory, you check out if the conditions to win the scenario have been fulfilled to determine the winner. It's also important to note that you can spend command points in some of these phases to reduce the damage, because for example, in the wound and morale resolution phase, you have the officer's fortune. So as section leader, you can spend one command point before any hits and convert it to wounds, and you can manage to reduce the hits by making a roll of a d10 and dividing that roll, that is the number of wounds that you reduce. Let's talk a bit about blood magic. This is exclusive for vampire characters. Blood magic is powered by blood, so every time your vampire character uses blood magic, he's going to take a wound. So it's not easy, you have to be really intelligent on how you're going to be spending these blood magic spells. You have things that are pretty self-explanatory, such as mesmerism, or mist form, or animal form, you turn into a wolf. Or maybe you have mass deceit. You can invoke this once per game, and every mortal character on the table suffers a penalty to accuracy. You can also levitate. You can also be a phantom in disguise, so you project a terrifying and huge flying monster in the midst of the enemy mortals within a certain number of centimeters of this position, and each enemy character within range must roll a d10 and deduct their discipline rating. On a modified result of 5 or plus, the character immediately fires any loaded weapons it is holding into the sky for no effect. So you basically make all of the enemy troops freak out and start shooting at something in the sky that isn't really there. You also have information on more specialized troops, like the Gravisky Reanimator or the Elf Field Hospital. Both of these types of troops, they keep your sections alive in their own particular way. You also have national characteristics in Flintloque. Depending on your nation and your race, you have different bonuses. You are good at different things. Because for example, the Ferrach Elf have a bonus when it comes to firing. Some others, like for example the Dogmen of the Confederation of Finkelstein, if you have 25% or more of the section made out of Dogmen, you actually have a bonus in initiative. Or if you have Centaurs, you have the best cavalry on Vallon, so when they enter melee with another non-Centaur mounted character, they have an advantage over their opponents. And when it comes to vampires, they have a Fanged Hiss, so they can unsettle other characters to the point that they are unable to reload any black powder weapons for the rest of the game, but these can only be used once per game. When it comes to gargoyles, they have the ability to hop and glide. Golems are bullet sponges, they are highly effective at taking fire. So each of the races and nations of Flintloque have their own national characteristics, and they do not cost points, so it's great for some thematic forces. You also have all the tables with all of the stats and special characteristics of the troops and the weapons, anything that you need to create all sorts of sections. You could create forces for different campaigns and scenarios. There is a lot of replayability and value in this Death in the Snow rulebook. You also have a lot of templates and counters and tokens that you can print. And near the end, you have the solo play rules. Now, these work in the following way. You have tables that determine the aggressiveness of the different forces that you face. Depending on the scenario, it's more appropriate that some troops will be more aggressive, perhaps if they are attacking and you need to defend a certain position, or maybe they are more defensive, maybe you are the attacker, or maybe they are just neutral in scenarios that feel a bit more tactical or take and hold or objective-based situations. And you basically draw out tokens to determine how the artificial intelligence is going to act during a battle. So this happens during each turn. Maybe that figure moves and wants to move on melee, or maybe it fires and moves, or maybe it will be determined that that figure will aim or reload instead. And you can also have an unknown quality for your enemies. That is, let's say you're playing solo or with a friend against this AI controlled force. You have a random way to determine how experienced that particular troop is. Maybe you are fighting enemies that are way above your experience level, and it's going to be a very difficult battle. You have details on how to control undead in solo play as well, concerning how they gain and spend dread points and how to end a solo game. So this is sort of like a mini game within Flintloque, but you could also adapt these rules for any of the scenarios. You just need to tweak a few things, adapt it to the special rules of a scenario, and you have a solo or co-op experience. Now let me tell you what I think of Death in the Snow. An excellent rulebook to get started with Flintloque. There are many ways in which you can get into Flintloque. You could start out with the Escape from the Dark Czar starter set, or any of the theaters of war. And this particular theater of war of the Death in the Snow, as I was telling you, has a very strong sort of like an action comedy with Tim Burton elements to it. I like it how the entire rule set of Flintloque, because I was only familiar with the introductory rule set, it goes deeper into the asymmetry of the two opposing forces. You feel the undead to be quite different on how they decay through the different campaigns, on how they use dread points and how they gain dread points by causing chaos in the battlefield, and how the Grand Acme du Nord feels a bit more specialized, more powerful, but at the same time replacing troops could not be as easy when it comes to the undead. They also have a different way of gaining command points and spending them in special abilities and powers, mostly related to the officers of the particular section. And what really amazes me of Death in the Snow is just the value. It feels like with the entire rules, all of the information and stats and powers and magic for the different troops and nations, with the different scenarios and campaign rules, this feels like they combined the core rule book with a campaign book, with a battle tome of sorts. It's just so complete. You can purchase this Death in the Snow book and you have all the information that you need. You do not need to make other purchases unless you want the mass battles rules. When it comes to rules, at least, because of course you would want to get the awesome looking Flintloque miniatures, but this is insanely complete and such a great value for it. This is the only purchase that you will need to do if you want to play this theater of war of Death in the Snow. You want to explore the other parts of the story, like for example, as I was telling you, War in Catalusia, but you could get that book instead or in addition. So it's great that they give you so many choices, and with all of those lists of troops and the special abilities for their races and nations, and there's so much here, and it feels a lot like a role-playing game because of the way that you create your character. You could create characters that are unique to each scenario or campaign, and you can see them grow and develop as they keep on fighting. So I highly recommend that you get this Death in the Snow rulebook for Flintloque. It's definitely the next step to take if you have played the Escape from the Dark Czar starter set, or if you are not very interested in that starter set and want to get into Flintloque right away with the complete rule set, then Death in the Snow, I highly recommend that you get this one. Well, thanks for watching my review. In about a couple of months, I'm going to bring out more Flintloque related content, more reviews of the different miniatures, more battle reports, and of the starter set that contains this Death in the Snow rulebook. If you are more into the physical book, you can wait and get that starter set or get the physical book by itself. It's also available for purchase that way. So if you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.